to another in the series of the Learning Spaces Collaboratory webinars. Some of you have been with us before. For those of you who are new to this series, our focus is on the planning of 21st century learning spaces for 21st century learners, with the emphasis on planning. Within the Learning Spaces Collaboratory, as many of you know, we are building a set of resources intended to inform the process of planning 21st century learning spaces, a process in which we see planners moving back and forth between 4 key questions to inform the planning process. And by asking these questions, it's our intent that the planners come to understand the feedback loop between learners, learning, and learning spaces, and questions about how do you know spaces make a difference that must be explored. In the final part of this webinar, we are going to introduce you to a few of the case studies taken from a guide for planning learning spaces that the LSC is developing with support from NSF. So this is a heads-up opportunity for some of you to get in before anybody else sees this. As you probably have noted, you are all muted in order to eliminate ambient noise. If you have any questions, you can enter them into the chat box. But as we indicated in the email that went out reminding you of the webinar, there will be 3 points during the webinar where we will stop and listen to you talk rather than you listening to us talk. So again, welcome. I am Jeannie Narum, Director of the Learning Spaces Collaboratory. And my involvement with the learning spaces builds on over 2 decades of involvement with campuses and architects in the arena of planning learning spaces. It's been a wonderful ride. Each of the 3 parts there, part 1, 2, and 3, will be an opportunity for us to wrestle with one of the individual planning questions that we've identified within the Learning Spaces Collaboratory as key to getting the planning right. What do we want our learners to become? What learning experiences make that happen? What spaces enable those experiences? We have 3 key questions for today. These are key questions we are going to address about how space matters, about the context for nurturing 21st century interdisciplinary problem solvers, global problem solvers, and about the process of planning. Our collective learning outcome for this webinar is that each of you has a deeper awareness about how questions about where students learn becomes a natural part of discussions and deliberations on your campus about how and what students learn. For the design professionals joining us, we're glad to have such a great group. We flip the equation, reinforcing what you understand as a professional about the practice of architecture, that understanding how spaces will be used, how the resulting spaces enrich the institutional context, how that understanding shapes the process of planning and programming and then planning. The emphasis of this particular LSC webinar is on a set of tightly interwoven goals for 21st century undergraduates. Our trio of facilitators connected at a workshop at Michigan State University last year, a wonderful workshop exploring every possible programmatic, curricular, and philosophical approach to nurturing 21st century problem solvers, except for the attention to spaces. We recognized then that there were and are significant spatial implications of interdisciplinarity, of shaping global communities of practice, of the complexity of contemporary problems that our students must be able to solve. And we 3 are on a mission to bring attention to the reality that space matters in this particular arena. This webinar is a continuation of a workshop that the 3 of us orchestrated at the AAC&U meeting in January. And throughout our conversation today, we'll kind of comment on what happened then and how that led to what we're talking about today. So these are the questions, as you, I hope, remember from the email we sent you, and I hope you're prepared to address them when we ask for them. So here's a catalyst for considering the question about why space matters, about the experiences and affordances of a space that nurtures and serves its learners. This is not a 21st century learning space, obviously, but we see here many attributes of 21st century learning spaces, including the potential for the serendipitous exchange of ideas, which is one of the emerging mantras kind of guiding those responsible for the character of 21st century learning spaces. This serendipitous collision seems to me to be particularly relevant in the context of the topic for this webinar today. If you look at this picture of the school of this image of the School of Athens through the lens of a 21st century learning commons, here you have, they're using the tools of the day, they're using books rather than scrolls, which would have been more fitting. You see people debating, reflecting. One might even imagine an iPad in the lower left, and there's certainly a globe in the lower right. As I looked at this again today, I thought this could almost be a gathering space in a STEM atrium in a STEM facility, or perhaps you could look at it as that the people in this space were learning to become citizens, practicing to become citizens, debating, negotiating, learning about how to work in diverse communities and diverse groups. I mentioned earlier the notion of affordances of a space, and if that's a new term for any of you, it was also for me when I got into this arena. But I've come to a definition of affordances that works for me in the context of the Learning Spaces Collaboratory. That affordance is something in or about the space that enables those in the space to do something, to experience something desired by those who plan the space, and to practice becoming. We're going to talk about affordances, but as we kind of go through all these PowerPoints, I invite you to think about, as you look at a picture of a physical space, to ask yourself and reflect on what is it in this space that seems to work. Here's a quick look at a 21st century space, and with a different kind of affordance. This happens to be an octoportal. And it's a space in which large data sets can be examined, shared, transformed perhaps, but it's a 21st century affordance that I think is going to be serving interdisciplinary global problem solvers that is gaining traction. Right now it's in major research universities and in campuses around the world, but we'll talk more about this later. But again, think about the affordances of that space. What does that space mean when we're talking about the topic of the day? Marcy, can you catalyze our thinking about interdisciplinarity?
Sure, Jeannie, thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marcy Sorter, Provost and Dean of the College at St. Olaf and a Professor of History. St. Olaf is a residential liberal arts college that has a long commitment to global and interdisciplinary education, and that includes robust offerings in the foreign languages, an off-campus study program that sends over 75% of our students to study abroad, a Center for Interdisciplinary Studies, and an Associate Dean for Interdisciplinary Studies. Prior to my time at St. Olaf College, I also had the opportunity to work closely with faculty members, students, and staff on planning a variety of types of spaces and implementing an extensive interdisciplinary effort called the Expanding Knowledge Initiative. So, why should we pay attention to preparing interdisciplinary learners? And how might physical spaces facilitate that process? We might want to think of this in terms of the 3 C's: complexity, connections, and collaboration. We are just at the beginning of profound changes taking place in the nature of knowledge. Digital technologies are giving us access to increasing amounts of information, and that information is increasingly easy to access. We can know more about more kinds of things than ever before. We are still in the process of understanding the significance of our new abilities to explore complex systems with big data and to explore connections both within and across existing bodies of knowledge. Another important reason to educate interdisciplinary leaders is that our world needs flexible and resourceful problem solvers, practiced in collaborating with people who may bring a different perspective or different expertise. Many times, our partners will come from outside of the academy. So what you're seeing before you now is a wonderful graphic taken from the New York Times, which depicts the knowledge network of connections now existing across the disciplines and subdisciplines. I encourage you to imagine how a network of scholarly connections might map onto this image, and in turn, how can physical spaces make possible the kinds of scholarly connections that lead to interdisciplinary learners and leaders. To recall Jeannie's earlier remark, we should be thinking of spaces as places for students to practice becoming interdisciplinary learners and global learners. Rick, would you now introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you very much, Marcy. Hi, everybody. My name is Rick Vaz, and I'm Dean of Interdisciplinary and Global Studies at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in snowy Massachusetts. We're a medium-sized private research university, and most of our students major in engineering or science. My own background is in engineering. For 40 years, WPI has had a project-based curriculum in which students have to complete a series of research projects, one of which is an interdisciplinary project equivalent to 3 courses. And over half of our students complete that project at one of our project centers that are scattered all around the world. So my job involves oversight of these faculty-led experiential programs where students are working in small teams under faculty direction to solve problems for agencies and organizations. These projects are very interdisciplinary, and they're focused more on social issues and human needs than on technology. So I guess my role today may be somewhat of a disruptor because my perspective comes from working with students in locations that are far away from the campus spaces that we're able to design. But I think that there's a lot that we can learn from those experiences to create better learning on campus as well. A lot has been said about global learning in recent years, and there are a lot of definitions out there. I want to talk a little bit about global learning in the context of today's discussion. I would say that there are 2 factors that motivate global learning. One is that we need new types of problem solvers who can tackle global problems such as climate change, energy and the environment, food security, water and sanitation, public health and disease, education, conflict and governance. All of these are global problems that are situated in different ways in different places around the world. And second, because the world is so interconnected, our students are going to have to make their way by developing skills and abilities that allow them to work across borders. I think Marcy has made very clear that our students are going to have to be able to move across disciplinary borders, but they're also going to have to be able to move and work across geographic borders and cultural borders. They need to be highly collaborative, flexible problem solvers with broad perspectives and able to function outside of their element. And I think that too often our campuses and curricula don't really lend themselves to that, because faculty and degree programs are organized around disciplines, and students often experience their education as a set of disconnected pieces that have disciplinary labels. So that's why I'm so interested in the powerful learning that happens when faculty and students leave the campus structures and the disciplinary ways of thinking behind and venture into other communities where the boundaries are more fluid.
All right, this is Marcy again. And Jeannie had mentioned that we were going to do a bit of reporting back to you on what happened at the planning group at the AAC&U meeting. So one of the first exercises that we invited the AAC&U group to do was to describe what interdisciplinary and global learners should become. The importance of coming to a shared sense of goals for becoming took some time to sink in. As the discussion went on, workshop participants increasingly became aware of how those goals should define learning experiences. As you look at this list of what learners should become, you can see that some elements could pertain equally well to disciplinary learners, but other items do speak to the distinctive nature of interdisciplinary and global learning. We will be returning a bit later to the question of what learners should become, but I encourage all of you to consider what is distinctive about interdisciplinary and global learning, and what distinctive strengths can it develop in learners and leaders. Rick, what did you observe with this exercise?
Well, Marcy, when the workshop groups in Atlanta developed their lists of what they wanted learners to become, I was struck by the extent to which the lists described abilities and attitudes and transferable skills rather than outcomes of traditional disciplinary learning. Now, research today suggests that our students will change careers, not just jobs, but careers 5 or 6 times. So not only are we preparing them for jobs that don't exist yet, but we're preparing them for careers we can't predict. So I don't think any of us doubt that our students need disciplinary knowledge and tools, but there's a growing consensus that the most important learning outcomes are transferable ones, things that students can transfer to new problems and new situations like flexibility, motivation, curiosity, creativity, and collaboration. And I agree with Jeannie's earlier point that the planning team has to also embody those outcomes. It's relatively easy for us to come up with these lists of aspirations for our students, but the tricky part is we need to be able to live up to them ourselves if we're going to be effective designers of learning experiences.
And Rick, what kind of experiences make these happen?
Thank you, Jeannie. As you can see from this slide, most of the experiences that the workshop participants identified have different elements of authenticity to them. And a lot of the traditional classroom settings and assignments that are pervasive on campuses across America, I think, are lacking some of those elements of authenticity. But students can tell the difference. Students know when they're given an authentic problem and something that the faculty have made up. Authentic problems are messy and constrained, they're ill-defined, but they're also highly motivating. When students are given work that matters to someone, work that could make a difference, they gain a different type of motivation. They gain an intrinsic motivation that I think can inspire them to accomplish more than grades ever could. So at this point, I'd like to pass it back to Jeannie to transfer us to talking about how to create those experiences.
The third part of the exercise in Atlanta was we've gone from Marcy talking about becoming, about the learning, Rick talking about the experiences, and then we challenged people to draw a picture of the kind of spaces they were thinking about that enable those learnings. And you can't quite get it perhaps exactly from this one, but Rick talked about learning being messy, learning being student-owned, learning spaces providing opportunity for the messiness, the student-owned, the serendipitous collision of ideas. And so we have found in the work we've done in the Learning Spaces Collaboratory that the challenge of moving back and forth between the learners, learning, and learning spaces is not an easy one, and I think we found this in Atlanta until we finally got to let people think about the physical space. They thought that's what the workshop was about, physical spaces. And I think the architects on the line will confirm or reaffirm the importance of understanding what the users are to become when you start to design spaces. But the drawing of the mental images that people have when they're thinking about the physical spaces is getting some people out of their comfort zone. Perhaps it's getting everybody out of the comfort zone. But if you think of the ideal planning committee on a campus for a learning space, even if it's for remodeling a single room in a library or something, it involves the physical plan officer, the IT officer, perhaps someone in assessment, perhaps a faculty member, perhaps a librarian, perhaps the provost is lurking around, or someone like Rick who's in charge of global is lurking around. So the language about space, there is no common language about space when that planning group gets together. And if one person's language or vision dominates, the space is not going to be as robust and probably as transformative over the long term than it is when people get together and wrestle together and come up with a common language about the space. So that's kind of the introduction to where we're going. It was a long introduction, but I hope you get the sense of the three questions we're going to explore, how we're going to explore it, and now we're going to move into what we want our learners to become. And this is a visual that many of you are very familiar with, you know, what employers think learners should become, or the skills learners should graduate with, as distilled and gathered by the AAC and U. It's a rather standard set of skills and abilities, but it's not these kind of lists are just a beginning point for planning teams to think about the kind of learning experiences. We're talking more about the becoming of the whole person, not just gaining a set of skills. We're talking about the effective nature of learning and the effective impact of spaces as well as the cognitive impact. On campus visits, when I make campus visits, I always ask the question of becoming. What do you want to become? And one student recently on a campus said, what I want to become is able to move seamlessly from my life on campus into my life in work that I am passionate about, into a world that I become recognized as the go-to person. When there's a problem to solve, they know I'm the go-to person. And I think if you engage students in thinking about what they want to become and involve the student voice in the planning of the learning spaces, the learning will be much more, the planning of the space will result in spaces that truly serve the institution over the long term. Marcy, you want to talk about this slide?
Sure. So in the previous slide, what you were looking at were some LEAP goals, and one of the workshop attendees at the AAC&U workshop asked us why we couldn't simply skip the becoming exercise and go straight to LEAP goals. And that's not a bad suggestion because they are clearly excellent goals. But our exercise asks us to think specifically about how learners develop into interdisciplinary and global leaders. Take, for example, the slide of sticky notes, which is before you right now, and each describes some element of becoming a global and interdisciplinary leader. What's interesting about these attributes, and you may want to think about Rick's comments earlier, is the degree to which they speak to the whole person. We asked faculty members who've been involved in interdisciplinary teaching to describe distinctive learning outcomes, and in addition to discussing elements such as an understanding of different knowledge systems and how to draw upon them, the faculty members identified elements very similar to what you see here, such as creative and humble, which doesn't appear here but certainly could. So let's take a look at a few examples of learning spaces, and as you look at the spaces, please reflect back on those lists of attributes that people have generated for learners. What you see here is taken from the Learning Spaces Collaboratory Guide, and it shows a problem-based learning room at Georgia Tech. So what's the message of this kind of space? There is no front of the room, and the seating and expansive whiteboard invite the sharing and critiquing of ideas. These learners are making what they are learning public, which is a key element in interdisciplinary engagement. The attendees of the workshop also noted that this space invited people to break the rules. People, after all, are writing on the walls, and if you put interdisciplinary learners in a space like this, the disciplinary walls come down too. Next is the plan of the newly renovated Duke Library, again from the LSC Guide. Libraries are, of course, some of the most interdisciplinary spaces on a campus. This floor of the Duke Library is designed for serendipitous encounters. There is a mix of different kinds of learning spaces, ranging from formal classrooms to seminar rooms to study spaces. And a good deal of the study spaces are proximate to the classrooms, so that teachers and learners can continue discussions that began in class. This floor was designed to be a sandbox space, where faculty from all disciplines can experiment with new tools, technologies, and pedagogies. And last, this is part of the renovation of the main library at the University of Pennsylvania. This was the university's first experience with intentionally planning for spaces where students from all programs and disciplines can gather. It's important to remember that spaces that encourage people to come together do not have to be fancy, but they do need to be welcoming. You may want to ask yourselves, what kinds of experiences and spaces facilitate the kind of knowledge network that we saw in the New York Times graphic?
So earlier, I spoke about the need for students to tackle authentic problems and about the value of bringing students out of their elements. The short video that we're about to show was made by a team of 3 undergraduate students as part of an interdisciplinary research project they completed in Namibia. And in their own words, the team will describe some of the challenges they faced and some of the lessons that they learned while being a little bit out of their element.
the informal settlements of Ojuwase are flooding and erosion, which occur during the storms of the rainy season. Despite Namibia's normally arid climate, the rainy season brings large volumes of water that can cause destructive flooding, wash away homes, and severely erode the land.
Well, Ethan and Nick and Nicole, the WPI students who spent 2 months working in the Ojuwase community to tackle the flooding and erosion problems, had to go well outside their comfort zones of discipline, geography, and culture to tackle this real-world problem. And one of the biggest lessons they learned was that the solution came from the community, not from them. While their work involved a great deal of background research and planning, I don't think you need to read their report to get an idea of how powerful a learning experience this was. Now, at WPI, where most of our students complete off-campus research projects like this, we've learned that getting them off campus is motivating, disorienting, and powerful. But it's important to note that this type of authentic problem-solving experience is available in every community. We do this sort of work in downtown Worcester as well as in Namibia. You don't have to go across the world to become a global problem solver. You can go into almost any city or rural area in America and find interdisciplinary problems that are rooted in cultural contexts and that require students to get out of their comfort zones. So I'd like to ask you to think about the lessons we might be able to draw from this that can help us plan learning spaces. And let's keep that question in mind as we now segue into the participatory part of this webinar.
So now we invite your questions and comments, and since I have the, and you are now unmuted, anybody can talk, so I'm going to, so we have an echo here? Okay, let me ask Brenda Farmer, how do you get people at Berkeley thinking about learning in the process of planning learning space?
Hi, this is Brenda. If you could repeat the question again, because there was a lot of echo in the background.
There is a lot of echo. Somebody on with a cell phone? Perhaps not. Brenda, talk about your conversations with your colleagues at Berkeley in talking about learning as a prelude to talking about learning spaces.
Well, most recently, I've been working with a group of students from mechanical engineering. They sought me out after there was some discussion about renovating some general assignment classrooms on campus. And so this is actually the first time that I've had students approach me when they found out about our active learning classroom in Dwinell Hall. And now I'm working with the students and the department from mechanical engineering, and we're sitting down and talking about the curriculum and what they want to do in the future for undergraduate education. So we've started a group of faculty, students, and planners like myself to meet on a monthly basis. We don't have a timetable set about how soon we want to accomplish this. We're really taking it step by step, and I think for them it's so new to be thinking outside of the box and thinking about what do we need to have in a learning space that will conform to those outcomes. So it's been really interesting.
Thank you. Any other comments? People thought about this beforehand? Sarah Hutton from Amherst? She's not on? Okay. Nobody wants to speak? I'm good. Sally?
Yes?
How do you, as a facilities person, how do you get people thinking about learning before learning spaces?
Well, one of the things is for them to assess, if they can, sort of what they think the issues are that they want their students to become. So it's a matter of them understanding where they are at currently and what they want them to become. So it's really sort of a leap of faith to look to the future as to what they want their students to be.
Is it easy?
This is Marcy here, and I really appreciate that comment because I found that to be the case too, that you pretty much have to start where people are now. So how do they understand students as learners now? And then it's possible to think about where do you want them to be, or what additional things might you want to accomplish.
Because I worked with a number of different schools that had different technical as well as then state university and more academic programs, it was really important for them to understand the types of students that they had, because I have to tell you, it really goes to the individual culture and people as to, one thing might work, an open classroom might be fantastic for some particular cultures and some groups, and to some it's very intimidating, and it actually does the opposite of freeing them up to do creative things.
Well, let's move forward, and I'm going to. This is the middle of the sandwich between learning and learning experiences. Marcy?
Sure. I love this cartoon. Apart from the wonderful idea that people might actually spring into action upon the orders of a provost, I think that this is an important cartoon at this stage in our discussion because it illustrates something about the planning process. If we think about the cartoon's project from the point of view of a learner, we can ask ourselves, how are we expecting interdisciplinary learning or global learning to take place? And where do we expect that learning to take place? And what kinds of experiences does the space help shape? This cartoon also recalls Rick's earlier comment about the need for planners to model the goals that they have for learners. The process for planning experiences and places for interdisciplinary learning needs also to be interdisciplinary. Where are the physicists, the biologists, and the humanists in this picture? And what would they tell us they need in order to collaborate?
So I think to move now toward the second question about experiences, the planning team needs to be self-reflective and self-motivated to think of itself as an interdisciplinary planning team. I thought all provost, everybody jumped when provost said something, Marcy, but perhaps not.
Well, I did too.
So this is the introduction to kind of experiences that make 21st century learners 21st century problem solvers. And you all, I know, understand or remember this is the IBM Watson. And immediately after the evening experience, the New York Times had an article about the process of planning Watson. And I have an increasing archive from newspapers and magazines about the nature of collaboration and problem solving in the 21st century that for me have spatial implications. So let me just read a little bit from the New York Times article that described the Watson experience. And it's by the leader of the team who he said, when I stepped up to lead the team at IBM, I knew the task would be formidable. And then he goes through the process. And then he ends by saying, from the first, it was clear we would have to change the culture of how scientists work. Watson was destined to be a hybrid system. It required experts in diverse disciplines, computational linguists, natural language processing, machine learning, information retrieval, and game theory, to name a few. Likewise, the scientists would have to reject an ego-driven perspective and embrace the distributed intelligence that the project demanded. Some were still looking for that silver bullet that they might find all by themselves. But that represented the antithesis of how we would ultimately succeed. We learned to depend on a philosophy that embraced multiple tracks, each contributing relatively small increments to the success of the project. Technical philosophy was important, but so were personal dynamics. And this is the affective skills our students leave with. Early on, I made the unpopular decision to bring the entire team together in a war room to maximize communication. The shared space encouraged people with wildly different skills and opinions to exchange ideas. We had to keep the team's collective intelligence from being overcome by egos or dragged down by desperation. Leadership had to be steadfast and persistent, but grounded in optimism. Through it all, the team developed a culture of trust that let creativity flourish. In the end, the hero was the team, not any individual member or algorithm. Eventually, everyone came to appreciate that. Well into the throes of the project, one researcher commented, compared to the way we work now, it's like we were standing still before. Watson went on to win, but its work is far over. Now we are developing new ways to put Watson to work. As for the members of the original Watson team, they'd tell you that never in a million years could they have imagined what we accomplished. Just like Watson itself, we all learned that the sum is much greater than the parts. And I think this is the world our students, our learners will be moving into, to be hybrid thinkers, to have become hybrid learners. And so think about this. This is a kind of image of the kind of global problem-solving interdisciplinary learner that we hope to graduate from our campuses. Let's think about these spaces for a minute. Marcy or Rick, do you have any comments on what happens, what kind of experiences are happening in these spaces?
Well, I think this is, the informality of this space makes it very inviting for a lot of different types of activity. You can see a lot of collaboration, but you can also see somebody in the lower right-hand corner who is very intently working by herself and looks very happy and comfortable to be there. The spaces are laid out in a way that appears to encourage people to move around. Looks like at least half the people are not sitting down. We can see a professor-like person perhaps off in the corner, and I like to imagine maybe that person's moving around the room and interacting with people in ways that are promoting the work that they're doing.
One of the things Rick didn't mention that he mentioned it in Atlanta was that his students were working in a iron shed. And when I looked at this picture and picked it for this part of the webinar, I thought this seemed to me to be similar to the picture of the students working in the messy, muddy iron shed in Africa. I also juxtaposed the picture of the School of Athens there to show the same kind of back and forth serendipity of ideas that can happen in that space. Marcy, do you have any comments, or should I move forward?
Go ahead and move forward.
Okay. So Marcy noted earlier that and I think one of the most prevalent 21st century spatial affordances are things to write on. walls, doors, windows, posts, huddle boards, whatever. And this again gets back to the making learning public, the externalization of what these learners are thinking and how their learning is becoming real. They're getting the language of learning out of their head and into a form that can be shared, critiqued, and understood. If I knew what I know now about whiteboards, I would have bought whiteboard stock when I started all this. Another of the Duke Library, with learning becoming a public shared activity, this is being done in isolation, but not most of the time. And here back to the OptaPortal. If Jen unmutes everybody, does anyone have experience on their campus with an OptaPortal or something like this? Perhaps in your art history department? Not yet.
This is Marcy, and we don't at St. Olaf, but one of the things that I think all of those images that you've just shown, starting with what looked like a kind of a sciencey workshop area, then through to the whiteboard, and then the clear glass with the writing surface, is the degree to which the visual is key. And this again is how one invites other people to participate. When I think about this image, I see a number of people who are joined in understanding something, looking at something. So I think that the issue of visual connection is part of what seems to be called for as we're seeking those scholarly, serendipitous connections that lead to interdisciplinary and global learning.
And this is a way, Rick, do you want to comment on the kinds of conversations that you could have with your students around the world and be sharing? I'm assuming you all, or I will tell you all, that each of those squares could be a different set of data, a different photo for comparing. Do you have any comments on this one, Rick?
Well, I do, because I think that one of the things that's rapidly changing is what it means to teach our students to be effective communicators. And the advent and proliferation of technology is making visual communication a third category, along with written and oral, that is increasingly important for our students to learn to work with. And so I think that drives a lot of the technology considerations for learning spaces, because increasingly I find that students are conveying the most important findings of their research through visual materials that would not have been feasible 10 or 15 years ago. So I think that this opens up a very exciting time for student work, particularly work that, for example, can lend itself to representation through geographic information systems or other rich visual platforms.
I became aware of the power and even the existence of technologies like this through reading recent NSF reports, which over the past several years have dealt with how to deal with large data sets, how to use technologies more effective. And as I read those reports, it's clear to me that this is not science fiction, that people are using it now. It is most prevalent, of course, in research and corporate settings, but I think in planning for the future, people should be, especially if you're doing interdisciplinary global thinkers, consider that such an affordance as this will be a part of their space for the future. And
I'd like to address Greg's question before we move on. He's asked if the ability to make each square display different data is the advantage of having the little images as opposed to one large screen. And that is an advantage, but the main reason is simply that a collection of smaller screens is a lot less expensive than one big one.
However, you can make it one big screen. You could have a single picture on it, as you can see from the background. So, but the picture that's on the screen now is taken from an elementary school in the UK, and it's a place which, from my perspective, is one of the more interestingly institutions that is playing around with technologies in a most interesting way. But as they are evolving, they're working with children on LED tables. And so when we think about planning spaces for today, these are the students who will be coming into our places into the future. So now, one more slide, and then you people, we're going to ask for your questions. And of course, spaces enable reflection. And one of the learning goals and learning outcomes we desire for all our students is that they become self-reflected, self-motivated learners. And so the spaces are not only the messy, muddy spaces, the collaborative, the exchange of ideas, but the spaces to step back and reflect on who you are and what you are becoming. So now you are once again unmuted, and Greg, you perhaps have another question? We have a question from Dan. Dan, do you want to ask your question publicly, and then we can your colleagues can respond to it?
Well, the question is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, the question is, what are our criteria to judge our success in making our students become global, creative, and interdisciplinary problem solvers? They sound like wonderful goals, and but how do we know when we've done it?
Well, I think that whenever we have a learning activity, we've got to be clear about the learning outcomes. We have lists of learning outcomes at the beginning of this, and there's never going to be a learning activity that addresses all of them equally well. But once you have a set of learning outcomes and you have the students creating some sort of product or performance or solution to something, you can develop rubrics and try to identify the extent to which the evidence of the student's work is showing those outcomes that we're looking for.
So what's the difference between learning outcomes and this vision of the becoming student?
I think that the student that we have a vision for is simply one who exhibits those outcomes, the ability to collaborate effectively, the ability to creatively solve problems, the ability to communicate persuasively in different media to different audiences, those types of things. And every one of those things can be, the extent to which the student meets it can be judged by some evidence, depending upon how you design your learning experience. So for the case of our students who went to Namibia, they had to write a research report that could be examined to determine the effectiveness of their problem-solving approach, the thoroughness of their background research, and so forth.
This is Marcy here, and Dan, I really thank you for this question because it is an important issue, and I love the question because I think then it challenges us to go back and revisit, well, how do we describe each of these attributes in ways that we then can evaluate, as Rick has described. I think about one person, David Lopato, who does a lot of research on students' intellectual development as they do research themselves. And one of the attributes that he describes or he measures has to do with levels of independence. And can the student move forward and design a project on his own or her own? How far can this person work on their own, and has a rubric for how you measure that. And of course, this asks for the faculty member in most cases to evaluate it. But there are ways to really kind of break down those what seem to be kind of ineffable character qualities and measure them.
This is Rick again. I just want to follow up a little bit and suggest that because this is a great question, and I think it's at the heart of a lot of this work. If you take a look at the American Association of American Colleges and Universities value rubrics, you can see some examples of tools that faculty can use to judge our success in this type of learning teaching.
Well, I think it is an issue for interdisciplinarity per se. I think the canons of excellence are probably maybe more developed in disciplinary traditions, and creative interdisciplinary work, you're sort of leaping where no one has gone before often, and I think sometimes I value that myself, but it's sometimes hard to make the judgments about when work is excellent or not?
No, you're absolutely right. I think that this is very challenging work, and it requires, I think, it requires faculty to sit down and come to some consensus about what they really care about, and then figure out how they're going to design that learning experience for those things and how they're going to recognize them when they happen. And sometimes you can't do everything, and the disciplinary learning may take a back seat in some of these learning experiences to some of the more transferable skills and abilities that we were talking about before.
I think when, I think Dan said something about this being a new realm that we're all trying to wrestle with, and I think that's one of the reasons that the three of us decided that like to start a conversation about why spaces matter to interdisciplinary and global and problem solvers. There's much evidence about the efficacy of problem-solving experiences. And so, Dan, we're all still trying to figure out how to make this work, especially in the process of figuring out if spaces make a difference in the context of the goals set for the learner. So in our final minutes, we're going to unmute you and talk about some spaces that are taken from the Learning Spaces Collaboratory Guide. And we're going to talk about 4 spaces in particular if we have time. Each of these spaces in the guide has stories about, or essays about, text about what they wanted the learners to become, about the experiences, and about the spaces. So let me start with the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And this is called a Discovery Center. It's part of their chemistry program, but it's not called a classroom. It's not called a laboratory. It's the Discovery Center, and where students come together on a scheduled time. So it is a registrar scheduled time, and this space was designed to enhance the motivation and persistence of minority students. So here are what they wanted their students to become, and these were understood before they planned the space. Committed, passionate, lifelong learners, practitioners in a community of scholars, risk-takers, entrepreneurs, empowered agents of change, responsible, compassionate leaders of tomorrow. And to get back to what Dan just asked, these might be kind of unmeasurable, but at least they're aspirational goals for those who kind of reorganized what students were learning, how students were learning, as well as where students were learning. Marcy, do you want to comment on the kinds of experiences that these students were engaged in this space?
Sure. The elements that really attract my attention are what looks like movable panels that you can write on. So you can imagine this being a space where it could be reconfigured. If a group wants to work semi-privately, that could be done. If one wanted to be completely surrounded with a surface you could write on, you could do that. And then the other issue is these circular tables that allow for group work, and in this case there are 2 monitors on each table. I don't know if these are connected so that the person working on one monitor is then sharing the same image with the person on the other monitor at that table. But that sort of connectedness and what you see and what you're working on is really critical.
I think the design of the space by Bill LaCourse and his colleagues were so people would learn to get inside the world of chemistry and debate it and really discuss and construct their own knowledge. So it's a very intentionally designed space in the mind of the mindset of the professor of chemistry. Rick, do you have any comments about this space?
I think Marcy hit on all of the key features of this space. It's a simple space. It doesn't look like it was expensive, but it looks like an effective learning space to me.
One key to this space is that the professor wanted to do something different, no space to do it. He took over the game room in the student center. And so this is a completely found space, a sandbox space, 96 students. They have 1,300 students in introductory chemistry who go through this space every week. So it's But it is a space that is an open space. And part of the fun of the space is that the windows into the student center are still there. So students walking by can experience this space. Different kind of space, but it's still a found space in a library for those librarians on the call. This space evolved through a collaboration between the Writing Center director and the librarian, recognizing that they wanted all their students not to be global interdisciplinary problem solvers, to be creative communicators. And so their goals were for this project, and they did have these beforehand: skilled in creative thinking, able to employ creative thinking to solve a variety of problems, able to use manipulatives to consider multiple perspectives and highly effective communication design, skilled in the design of effective communications, skilled at using and producing information with impact, understand creative rhetorical techniques that can be used to understanding many communication scenarios. Rick, how do you prepare your people? What kind of spaces do your students learn to move seamlessly between cultures before they leave WPI and go abroad?
Well, you know, what I've found is that our students are very adept at creating their own spaces as long as they have the right tools. So none of them is ever without a laptop. And one of the things I notice when I look at this space, that on every corner of every one of those green tables, there appears to be what I think is, access to electrical power and maybe a hardwired connection. I think that connectivity facilitates serendipitous learning spaces for this generation to a large extent. And when our students are here on campus preparing to do project work around the world, where they'll have very little control over their learning spaces, each team seems to find its own favored spot. Some of them work in tech suites in the library where they can use a large screen on the wall. Some of them prefer to work in their apartments or dorm rooms. But they seem to understand that they're preparing to go out and work in a place where they're going to be having to innovate their own spaces that allow them to be productive.
So a student-owned space is where students take ownership of the space, might be a hallmark we should all work toward, even if it's in our country.
Well, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I can tell that one of our teams is functioning well when whatever space they may have been given to work in suddenly becomes bedecked with things that they hang on the wall: mission statements, sets of goals and objectives and tasks. When they begin to have shared information that is important enough to post publicly, that is usually a very good sign that the team is functioning and that they've taken ownership of whatever space they may have.
Dan, let me get back to your question. Although this isn't on interdisciplinary global problem solvers, it is on creative problem solvers. And when I asked Eastern Kentucky University what is the evidence that the space matters, here are what they sent back to me: that there's improvement in retention and persistence within the classes, that there's improved class performance, that they know how to spontaneously form groups and study groups, but there's a growth in community and collegiality. So they have measured, taken responsibility for measuring these students who come into the center and then leave the center. Given the time, I'm going to move quickly and talk about this space. Comments from the field. So Rick and Marcy and I will be quiet. So what are the affordances in this space that make it work?
This is Brenda from Berkeley. It reminds me of a space at the Design Center in Stanford University where it is totally comfortable. It looks very Well, you have a lot of tools at hand for the students to play with. It's like a playground. You can see technology all over the place in the room, infrastructure, writing services, music, power. I mean, it looks very friendly and it looks like a fun place to be.
Other comments? What a quiet bunch. This happens to be the Design Center at Stanford.
I knew it. It's a great place, and it really is. You can't tell unless you're in the space where you can see how the students are using it. It's amazing. I mean, you really do want to get in there and start putting your hands on everything.
Jeannie, this is Marcy, and I'm noticing these interesting almost holes in the table surface. Is this where people can scoot up a little bit more closely? So you've got combinations of big surfaces for working and then opportunities to be a little bit closer face to face?
I don't know the answer to that, but I have a lot more photos and I can share them with anybody who wishes to see them. It's a great space. Why I wanted to end with this, and there's one final one final slide, is that campuses need spaces like this to play around with new ways of doing things. And this could be a space in which faculty and facilities officers and IT people figure out how their students experience space, what it takes to get back to Dan's question, what kind of spaces nurture the kind of learners we're talking about today. I have another photo, which I didn't bring up, from the IT lab at the University of Notre Dame. And they, in their IT, Brenda, you will love this, in their IT office, they have a hammock hanging from the ceiling because their students work so long and hard that they like to go up and down from the hammock. But I think campuses need messy spaces to play around with, creative spaces to play around with. This would not be the only space, and it would not be available to everybody, perhaps. But the playing around with space, I think the creative individuals do want to, as Marcy just said, arrange, modify, and adapt their personal space to meet their own needs and their whimsy. Creative people do have messy spaces, and they want to have hands-on involvement with the space. Rick, do you have any comments about that space?
Well, I have to admit, I'm just sitting here and trying to figure out how I could set up a hammock in my office.
Finally, Marcy, any comments on the tree?
I think this is really a slide for Rick, but do recall that wonderful image from the New York Times when you look at that tree.
Yeah, you know, the image of the community below it suggests that, you know, every community needs to figure out what learning spaces are going to work best for them, and you know, it's going to be a combination of, you know, Jeannie talked about found space, and I think that very often where our students are going to be in situations where they need to find space, but we can create the opportunities for them to find better spaces by putting our campuses together in ways so that those opportunities are more likely to happen.
That was very well said, and I thank both Rick and Marcy for joining me on this webinar, and to all of the participants. As I said at the beginning, we hope to expand and extend this conversation. We are just starting thinking about the implications of the spatial implications of nurturing interdisciplinary global problem solvers. There's much more to be said. The people in Atlanta were frustrated with the short time we had there. We had a half a day. So we invite your responses to this webinar back to us. We will keep a conversation going should you wish to do that. And thank you again for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.